You are listening to the Toxic Mold Podcast with Steve Worsley, the toxic mold expert and your number one source for mold consulting and mitigation in the USA. Let's dive into a brand new episode. Before we get started on this episode, here's a not so short disclaimer. While all attempts have been made to verify the content provided in this podcast, neither the podcaster or the producers assume any responsibility for errors, omissions, or alternative interpretations of the issues discussed here. All information stated in this podcast is the opinion of Steve Worsley. Steve Worsley is a mold specialist with over 25 years of experience in the construction and mold industry. The Toxic Mold Podcast is for information sharing purposes only. The views expressed are those of the podcaster and his alone. These views should not be taken as expert instruction or commands. While there may be references to medical conditions and symptoms, all podcast episodes are the opinion of Steve Worsley, and any medical questions or concerns shall be addressed with the appropriate licensed medical professional or professionals. As the podcaster refers to different mold types, please be aware that Steve Worsley is not a microbiologist, and questions concerning mold specifics should be answered by the appropriate professional. Steve isn't, nor does he offer any legal advice. For any legal advice, you must speak with a lawyer. The listener is 100% responsible for his or her own actions. You can check out Steve's books on Amazon. Just go to Amazon and search for author Steve Worsley. You can also take Steve's courses on Udemy or Skillshare, and you can find out more about those at cnccontractorservices.com. Now, let's get to the episode.
Hello, you're listening to the Toxic Mold Podcast with myself, Steve Worsley, and we have my wife, Cassandra. How's it going?
Going good.
We got the Super Bowl behind us.
Yes.
So it's middle of winter for most of our listeners. I'm sure it's not very warm, but today's subject is an interesting one. We've talked about it numerous times, and it's new construction and toxic mold. So do you believe a new home can have mold?
Well, I know it can, and you wrote a book about new construction and mold.
Yep. A lot of people, probably one of the most common things I hear from my clients, which there are a lot of things I hear all the time, but one of them is, well, I need to know if I can fix our home or if we should just go buy a brand new house. And sometimes it's not always a brand new house, just buy another home. And I always tell them the same thing. You can have mold anywhere. Mm-hmm. So I get it. If you're sick, your spouse is sick, your kids, one of your kids, your mom, whoever, I understand it's easy to just say, we need to just sell this house. You could sell your house and move into a house that's even worse.
That's true.
As a home inspector, I saw flips all the time. Brand new coat of paint, they fixed a bunch of things, and I always warned my clients, I'm like, from an inspector's point of view, that is the thing that we do not like to see is a fresh coat of paint, because they could have covered up anything.
Absolutely. And I think sometimes people assume that new construction means not susceptible to mold issues because it's really old homes that have those kinds of issues. When in fact, some of the oldest homes, stone homes, are like the most mold resilient you're going to find.
Exactly. Like, I don't want to go down that rabbit hole, but, part of the reason, speaking of my books, the first book, The Mold Epidemic, the reason we're experiencing this is because of all of the toxins in our building materials. Mm-hmm. Like even a 2x4, any listeners out there that actually know, a 2x4 is not actually 2 inches by 4 inches. It's 1.5 by 3.5.
Okay.
In the old days, a 2x4 was a 2x4.
Yeah.
And as crazy as it sounds, it's just the world we live in. In the old days, we used mud and natural materials to, fill in the gaps between the logs. These days, we're just using all sorts of toxins that are in insulation, sheetrock, everything.
So I think the only thing you have to do if you're just somebody who doesn't understand 2x4s and all of the construction language is just when you're driving out and about and you see a new construction going up, whether it's townhomes being constructed or a new subdivision going up or a house being built, and it's the middle of winter and it's raining or it's snowing and the wood is exposed on the ground or the building is framed and the wood is exposed, just ask yourself, where is that moisture going?
Exactly. I mean, all that moisture in those lumber piles is going into the home and then it's getting covered up. And at the end of the day, if that moisture, here's a good teaching moment. If it's a 2x4 and the moisture content is higher than 15%, they should not be putting sheetrock on it because it's too wet.
Yeah.
And, this is why I deal with new construction issues all the time. It's almost terrifying for me to see general contractors that have no idea about mold. They'll just say, oh, that's lumber mold. That's a term we hear all the time. Well, okay, like a cut is a cut. And if it needs to be stitched, it's got to be stitched. Mold is mold. Mm-hmm. Whether it's lumber mold or anything. At the end of the day, you have to address it.
Correct.
But you bring up a great point. Like they're building townhomes down the road and they're going up as quick as they can throw them up. Mm-hmm. It's almost crazy. Yeah. We're literally talking, they pour the foundation. Of course, you got to let the foundation cure a little bit before you start setting floor joists. But they're literally throwing them up in like 4 months,
Completely.
5 months.
They're on a timeline. And so you have to ask yourself, when you're seeing things get slapped together so quickly in an external environment where there is snow and there is rain and things are getting wet and they're just exposed and wet, but they're still putting it together and like getting it done so it can be sold, where do you think that moisture is going?
Yeah, exactly. And, it brings up a subject that a lot of our listeners are probably asking themselves, well, what about the code inspector? Depending on your city, county, municipality, you have code inspections. Well, a lot of people are just like, and when I did home inspections all the time, I heard this. Well, it's new construction. It passed the city inspection. We're good to go. Your local code inspector, there's a few factors, and I don't want to go down that rabbit hole, but they don't have any legal liability. I mean, unless you file some class action lawsuit. So you can't go back on them because your foundation's cracking. They're just there to do a code inspection. They're not there to identify things like all that wet lumber. Mm-hmm. I don't know of a code inspector that carries a moisture meter.
Correct.
And maybe some do. Yeah. I'll probably get some backlash over that. But my point is they're there for a certain job, and that's to make sure it's built to code.
Correct.
We don't really have codes when it comes to indoor air quality.
That's true.
Does that make sense?
That's very, very true. So then I guess somebody listening to this is like, oh my goodness, so what do I do about avoiding mold in a house that I'm spending a lot of money having built right now? What's your answer?
You need to hire an IEP.
Which most people never think about when they're buying a newly constructed home.
Right. And, we have packages. We might have some listeners that have dealt with me personally on new construction, and they're probably pretty glad they came across my services. But it's important, even if our listener doesn't hire an IEP, if they're having a brand new home built, go to the construction site periodically and look at things. Now, as a contractor myself, it is very frustrating when the homeowners are showing up every day.
Wanting to walk through the house.
And they're like, well, that window doesn't look good there. Can you move it over here? And I'm like, well, that's change orders. But just keep an eye on things. If your home's being built and right now it's snowing and your 2x4s or floor joists or roof trusses are just laying on the ground and they're not covered, that's something you should bring up to your contractor. And when your contractor's like, well, once the stuff's installed, once we set the joist, they're there long enough to dry out. Well, okay, so how can they prove that to you?
Yeah, but it brings up a different point. We were driving yesterday and we were looking at a vacant lot where they were surveying it and it had all this water in the middle of it. I think this is almost an issue that goes when you're buying the land or when you're like, shouldn't you be asking the realtor, like, what was underneath this subdivision? Like, was this in a lake? Was this in a swamp?
An old dump site? Yeah, my exact words to you were, if somebody from another county or from California or another state started building a home there, they would have no idea that there was that pond sitting there. Mm-hmm. That's a problem. Now, I'm not saying you can't build a home where a pond was, but your soils test and the type of foundation that you do, there's options is my point. Like you can drill piers down. You can over X, meaning you go 2 foot deeper and then bring in engineered fill and then do compaction, jumping jack or plate compactor, then you do compaction tests. There are things you can put in place to make sure that that house isn't going to fall off that hill. We talk about that too all the time. People building on the side of the mountain or above a rock quarry.
Yeah.
Every time we drive by those places, I look up at those homes and I'm like, well, no wonder why your foundation's sliding.
Absolutely.
You're right above a rock quarry built on a hillside. So the IEP part is important. And I guess it's easy for me to say because it's the business I'm in. But if you don't have the $500 to pay for an IEP or a consultant or whoever, do you have the $20,000 to fix your foundation?
Yeah, that's a very good question. But I guess my question, thinking about it in layman's terms, is when you're building a new house, when do you bring the IEP in? At different points, more than once, when should the IEP on a new construction come in to do some form of assessment?
So our listeners aren't going to like this answer, but you should have one the entire process.
Okay.
I dealt with a client that they're doing new construction. There was a home there. They tore it down. They're building a new one. They ended up having a mold concern in the crawl space. And that's when I got involved. So the foundation's been poured. All the framing was done. They were drying it in, meaning they were putting the roof on. Then they were going to do the siding. As I asked more and more questions, I'm like, but why did they build it here? What were the soils like? There's a creek that's back there 100 feet away. Why don't they have sump pits? What did the soils test show? I started asking a bunch of questions. But to answer your question, for our listeners, let's just say, we're all money's tight. It's a tough market right now, especially with housing prices in Utah and parts of Wyoming. I get it that people don't have a couple $1,000s to pay for a consultant or an IEP, but you should have them throughout the entire process. Okay. Now, are there certain points where it's very important to bring in at least just an inspector? I would at least get a home inspector in there after the foundation's been poured and they're starting to rough it in.
Okay.
I would do for sure a pre-drywall inspection, meaning the house is looked at before they put insulation and drywall up.
Okay.
And the proper IEP will know at what points they should be there. Because if you called me and you're like, hey, Steve, can we do a VPA? Because I live in Florida. They're about to dry in. I heard your podcast. I want to do a drywall inspection or pre-drywall. Well, if we do that VPA and the insulation's already up, that's kind of a day late and a dollar short.
Mm-hmm.
We want to see before insulation's even put up. Because we're looking for mold, voids in the exterior, make sure they're putting spray foam in the proper places. There are certain parts of the construction process that are very important that the IEP is there. So for our listeners, they're probably like, wow, that wasn't much of an answer, but you should have somebody there through the entire process.
Agreed. And so I can hear somebody listening to this and going, okay, that's good to know. But what if they're 75% of the way done with the new home construction? Are there still, or maybe they haven't even started building a home? What are the red flags that people either way should be looking out for with new construction and mold?
So I would tell our listeners, talk to your contractor and ask questions. Do you understand mold? And if they just chuckle and they're like, mold's everywhere, that tells me they don't care. Mm-hmm. But even if you talk to the owner of the company, which obviously I'm the owner of our company, that doesn't mean everybody below me has the same knowledge I do. You might have a contractor that gives a good speech. Show up and ask the site foreman, hey, do you understand mold? Now, once again, I'm not saying that the contractor, the site foreman, the superintendent has to be mold literate. But on the other hand, they have to or should understand the health effects from mold exposure. Because if they don't, I'm not saying they would do it purposefully, but they would just cover up any mold concerns.
Absolutely. So then definitely making sure that you're being proactive with it. Are there red flags? Oh, actually, let me go back to a different question because another question popped up in my head. Because I've almost bought a brand new construction home with a construction company that just puts together, they're not spec homes, they're
Track homes.
Track homes. So I was never going to meet the contractor.
Right.
Right? Like, so if you're buying in a subdivision that is established and it's one brand and they're building track homes, what do you do there?
So I'll just ask you about your specific situation. Was the home being built? Was it already built?
It was pretty much done. There was no grass yet.
Okay. So what I would do, I would tell our listeners to do is in that subdivision, and once again, you don't know for sure if the same builder built every home, but in that subdivision, go look at the homes that are finished. For what you're talking about, we have what's called a model home.
Yes.
So the model home, when we're building track homes, per se, meaning for our listeners, track homes are you're buying in a Ivory Homes subdivision and they have 5 different types of homes.
Yep.
When we build the model home, we're going to make sure aesthetically everything looks great. Mm-hmm. And I guess the best way to say it is not every home in the subdivision is going to be built like the model home. So go look at a few of the homes that were built. Now, if it's a brand new subdivision and you're buying one of the first 10 homes, ask, and it's probably going to be a real estate agent, ask the realtor, what other subdivisions have they built? And go drive through those.
Okay.
And pay attention. Like if there's vinyl siding, typically, in the middle of the summer on the west side of the home, you can drive by and see if the siding's all buckling. They didn't even install it properly.
Okay.
So to answer your question, the best thing would be is because talking to the owner of the company is probably not going to help much, but just go look for yourself.
Okay.
And then ask the realtor or whoever the salesperson is, say, hey, can we go over and look at one that's being framed right now? And if they're like, no, we can't do that, it's a construction site. And you could be like, well, I have a hard hat in my truck or whatever. I guess my point is see if you can do that.
Okay.
If they're throwing you every excuse in the world why you can't go and look at one being built, to me, that would be a red flag.
Okay.
Does that make sense?
That does make sense.
So it's, once again, going to, homes that have been built, even if it's for a few months, is their fence up? Mm-hmm. Does the grading and drainage look like it's sloped properly? Mm-hmm. Like there's a lot of things. If there's a home, let's just say it was one of the first 5 homes in the subdivision. The owners, so it's occupied at this point, the owners have lived there for 6 months. If you drive by there and there's no fence up and the yard's still not done, that's probably a good indication of how long it's going to take them to do those things.
Exactly.
And to me, it's somewhat of a red flag. Like you probably, when you closed on that home before you moved in, you paid for all the landscaping and the fence. Mm-hmm. If 6 months later it's not done, that's probably a red flag.
Absolutely.
Does that make sense?
That does make sense. So really see what's been built before, see what's currently being built now. And then as your home is being built, let's say you're doing a custom build, which is totally different. You could talk to the contractor and you could say like, what's going on? But are there things that the owner should be watching for if they're custom building a home from scratch? Like, are there things they should be paying attention to as it's being built?
Yeah, like the lumber just sitting out.
Okay.
If it's raining or snowing and nothing's covered.
Okay.
If they're throwing it up like
fast.
Yeah. If the whole home, they're telling you it'll be built in 4 months, that's probably a red flag.
Okay.
Now, I'm not saying you can't build a home in 4 months, but you have to decide, are we willing to compromise quality over how quickly the home is built? Mm-hmm. Like you can't build a home quickly and have all qualities the same, if that makes sense. Absolutely. They have to cut corners somewhere.
Yeah.
Once again, if contractors are listening, I'm not saying it's not possible, but for the most part, it's just like finding an IEP. If you want somebody that's the cheapest, they're probably not experienced, or they could be experienced, but it's a brand new business. There's going to be reasons behind that. But if you only go with the cheapest one or the contractor that throws them up the quickest, you have to ask yourself, how are they doing that?
Absolutely.
Does that make sense?
It does make sense. So what's your call to action for people?
Don't just assume a new home means it's a healthy home.
Ooh, yeah.
That's
and get an IEP involved early.
Yeah. And we can, even if our listeners are like, well, we've already closed, we just moved in, there's always circumstances and situations where we can help. If you're already moved in, but you're 1-year warranty, which is typically what the contractor gives you, and you're at the 10th month, get somebody in there to do an inspection before the warranty expires. If you're 2 weeks away from closing on it, it's still not too late. You can get an IEP in there that can go do air testing. They can do radon testing. They can do a full inspection. Even if you don't get an IEP, get a certified home inspector. So my point is you can always get somebody no matter where you're at in that process.
Absolutely. Really good advice. And you can always hire Steve. So
Yeah.
cnccontractorservices.com, go look up the consultations.
Yeah, exactly. And we offer consultations. We have a package I just put together for a client in Grand Cayman.
Yeah, you work with people around the world.
Exactly. And we, originally they're like, hey, what would you charge to come down here for a week while they're doing remediation? I'm pretty sure the price that I gave them would be close to what I would charge if I went there for a week.
Absolutely.
But this actually is virtual inspections, daily walkthroughs with the remediation crew, meeting with my client every week. Like, we can make it happen.
Absolutely.
Don't just assume we're too expensive or whatever. So, like you said, go to our website. Thank you for all you listeners. We appreciate all of you. Have a great week.
Thank you for listening to this episode. Make sure you go to our website at cnccontractorservices.com and sign up for the mold investigation checklist. Again, go to cnccontractorservices.com and get your free mold investigation checklist today. You can also, on cnccontractorservices.com, find out more about Steve's courses and books and consultations. Once again, go to cnccontractorservices.com.